Hello and welcome to episode 2 in season 2 of the JAIAC's Dispute Management in a New World podcast series. I'm your host, Roxene Nickle. And in this episode, we will take a look at small size, big problems, financing development in emerging economies, policy investment, and dispute resolution. We're joined by our resident guest, Dr. Christopher Malcolm, JAIC Secretary General and Dispute Management Practitioner. Welcome back, Dr. Malcolm.
Thanks, Roxene.
So let's get right into it. Break down for us what is meant by emerging economies.
When we think of emerging economies, we typically think of economies that are transitioning from low income, low levels of development, and moving towards what is considered a higher income and higher levels of development for their citizens. Now, it is sometimes, in our context, we very often speak of developing economies, and there's very often a distinction made between the two, in that the emerging economies are those economies somewhere in the middle, whereas the low income and developing ones are considered to be somewhat more at the bottom. A lot of economies, including those in the region, are considered to be more on the cusp of emerging, though very often considered to be developing economies. And if we think of some economies, for example, that could be considered to be emerging, we think of a Russia, we think of, some persons even think of China, some think of Brazil and Saudi Arabia, and those economies where you see them moving away from what were traditionally more on the line of not lots of development by reference to what we consider to be first world economies. And they're moving towards that. And in fact, getting to a point where we're seeing the development standards in these economies being pretty much equivalent or tending towards what we see in what we consider to be the more developed economies.
Set the tone for us, Doc. Sharing your interpretation of small size, big problems in the context of emerging economies.
In our context of the Caribbean, for example, when we think of small size, we think of the fact that we have small geographic size, small population size, and generally speaking, small size of wealth or incomes. So that generally is where we are. Now, when you think of that now in terms of how that relates to emergence and how that relates to financing and those issues, the fact is that the smaller you are, the less you have in terms of capacity for scope and scale. So a small economy generally is one where you don't have the capacity for large scale industrial development, for example. You don't have large land mass which would allow you to enter into mega-sized developments of one nature or the other, or even mega-sized farming. So in our context, for example, in the Caribbean, when we think of a large farm of, say, growing sugar or bananas or whatever it is that is being grown, that in a sense is a small farm in what would be considered one of the bigger economies because of their sheer size and what they're able to invest in terms of what they do. So what that immediately does is that it means that for your economic development objectives and what you're doing, you are forced now to try to eke out and to have efficiencies being created without the possibility for the economies of scale, meaning that the larger you are, the more you can spread your investment and spread your labor and spread your other inputs across a broader range and a larger economy, personal economy, that you're able to rely upon. But with small size, you're forced into being efficient.
How do you define economic development?
Well, economic development, and sometimes people try to, and we should actually try to make this distinction between economic development and economic growth. Growth really is a linear measurement of, let's say we started at $20. And over time T, you're able to see a move to $25. You have a growth there of $5. Economic development, however, measures a lot more intangibles, and it does mean different things to different people. But the basic measure of economic development, which I think most people would agree on, is that economic development is really a concept where you look at wealth creation, how an economy is able to create wealth, which then is used to sustain and enable social and other benefits to the population. So economic development is much more holistic in nature than economic growth. So in the context, for example, of small and emerging economies and what they're required to do, when you're thinking of economic development, you're thinking of, yes, we're seeing the growth, but the question now you want to know is poverty being alleviated in a way which matters to everybody? Are you seeing the schools being developed? Are you seeing healthcare being developed? Are you seeing all of these other support services that make for better living going along with monies being developed by way of growth? So that is what economic development tends to be and what we should focus on.
There must be some specific categories of problem faced by smaller economies. Can you say what some of those could be?
Well, those frankly, they range in many ways. One of which I mentioned earlier in terms of the scope and scale. So a specific problem faced by small economies is one of scope and scale. And how does that manifest? It manifests in that because you have small capacity for the goods and services that you produce. You necessarily, for example, you can't produce or import in bulk in the way many other jurisdictions can. So let's say you're to go to the oil market. Let's use that as an example. Whereas a large economy, because of the large volumes that they're buying, can go to a major oil producer and purchase and expect to get bulk and volume discounts. Small economies are not able as well to get that, because you cannot go to a manufacturer and say, I'm purchasing however many millions of barrels of oil per day that a larger economy would be. So for them, it is just not as beneficial. Another thing that comes about in an interesting way as well is relating to, for example, banking services. Each bank needs to have its own banks in other jurisdictions. So let's say, for example, we're in Jamaica. If we want to do business in the US dollar, we have to have a bank in the US that is able to trade and deal in our US dollar transactions, because until you net and settle on a US bank, a US dollar note in your hand means absolutely nothing. But if it is that you're a small economy and you're trying to deal with a big bank, say in the US, as your correspondent bank, then what they will look at is the risk that they're undertaking, which quite frankly are not much different in larger than smaller economies. They're going to look at their profitability and make a decision. Is it worth my time? Is it worth my effort? Is the profit that I'm likely to make something that I'm prepared to go through the risk of dealing with? So those are some issues. And of course, you get to the issue as well that notwithstanding how small you are as a state, you still have to run the business of government. And there are multiplicity of issues relating to that, including financing. That when the financiers, again, are thinking, should I invest in an economy or not? They're looking to see what is the likely profitability that we're going to be looking at. And the smaller the economy, the greater the risk that you're not going to be able to make the mega profits that you want to make. So those, again, create a set of issues. And with that, interestingly enough, since we're in this dispute management arena, comes questions relating to dispute management, because regardless of the size of the economy or even the size of the project, disputes are going to manifest. And small economies, because they have limited resources, are not able to be as specialized, for example, in some areas as larger economies would be able to do. So you then have dispute resolution issues related to capacity that could also arise in those circumstances.
Okay, well, let's stay with the small economies. So what are some of the difficult choices that these small economies have to make and the issues that are resulting as a result of their choices?
I think a big choice that every economy has to make, small in particular, has to make is this. Do I pay my doctors and nurses, or do I invest in a park? In every society, people want to have recreation, but they also want to have good health care, they want to have good education, they want to know that their roads are fixed and all of that. Now, if you're small, not only by reference to size, but by reference to your capacity to spend, you now have to very often make a choice. Do I fix 2 miles of road, or do I invest in repaying a loan? Right? And the question there is not always an easy one. So very often, you have economic priorities, pure and simple on the one hand, and social wishes on the other. Now, the social wishes will determine whether people feel a sense of belonging and whether they're able to enjoy their countries, their jurisdictions as best they can. But very often you have to make a hard choice between, should I pay the IMF loan that has become due? Should I pay some other for goods and services that must come in so we can feed? Or should we fix a road or build a new park or these other things? And very often, the social spend for recreation and these other things which make for holistic living often becomes things that are put to the side in favor of meeting what would be considered pure economic objectives.
What are some of the tools that you've identified that can help make these smaller economies as they seek to finance their development?
Well, one of the things in terms of, and that is where regionalism, for example, comes in. When you're small, the best way you can have value is by merging or joining with others. Because the smaller you are, the less you have of a capacity of getting at the decision-making table. And the decision-making table, not just because it's not available to you to get there, but you just have the resources to split across every possible agenda that could be made available. You just don't have it. So what we have to do, frankly, is to find a way of enabling and developing capacity, for example, in the context of the Caribbean, how it is that we can enable, and we've done it in the past, for example, with the Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machine, when it worked in a particular way, where we're able to create specialized agencies that have the capacity for serving multiple jurisdictions. How do we, for example, in a region such as CARICOM, in other regions in the Pacific and elsewhere, find a way where you can create a pool that is able to serve multiple governments and to properly address their priorities? But with that is a difficulty. Why? Because every government has its own priorities, and every government would want to know that their priorities are moved at a pace they want to move it. So there are possibilities, but there are also limitations related to those possibilities, and that's one thing you need to look at. Another thing which I started looking at, frankly, probably about 20 or so years ago, was the area of dispute resolution, incapacity, or vulnerability, as I called it. And at the time, I was very interested in developing what I consider to be this dispute vulnerability index. And I've done some work on it, a fair amount of work on it, quite frankly. And the idea is how we can, in the context of the inevitability of disputes, find a way to ensure that we recognize and consider what inevitable disputes are likely to be in the context of our economies as a region as a whole, then find a way to develop the relevant skill sets, and then to ensure that we deploy those resources both at national level and at regional level as appropriate to deal with the disputes as they arise, so that we are not caught out often, as we are often do, in a situation where we just don't have the capacity and we're not able to deal with issues relating to intellectual property, issues related to trade and investment, and so on.
On one hand, you have businesses, on the other hand, you have policymakers. Can you talk to us about their roles and how they converge in terms of development and better collaborate?
The role of government, frankly, is typically to ensure that you create an enabling environment for businesses to function. So there's this symbiotic or synergistic relationship that really must be created between business and government, or business and policymakers. Because the policy really is supposed to be devised to ensure that the people in the society, including businesses, are able to thrive and feel a sense of belonging and a sense of their capacity to become who they want to become. Now, in that context, businesses will, as they often do, lobby governments directly and indirectly, and governments need to be responsive to those in a way which balances the competing needs in any society. So on the one hand, you will have competing needs of businesses, but you will have the needs of what we would consider the ordinary citizen, who is not necessarily a business person in that context, whose interest needs also to be balanced. So you have to have an arrangement where businesses recognize that they're functioning with the support of government, and in a way where what they're doing should be aligned properly to government policies as well, in a way which makes for their own productivity. And government itself needs to develop policies and support mechanisms that are properly aligned with the capacity of the business community to grow, recognizing that it is when the businesses grow and thrive that the ordinary citizens will be able to have good employment, have good sources of revenue, develop their own individual economies, which by extension would then develop the economy as a whole.
And just to remind you that the JAIAC's Dispute Management in a New World podcast series is available on Buzzsprout, Spreaker, Podbean, the JAIAC's YouTube channel, and wherever else you get your favorite podcast. And also to remind you, we're here in Jamaica at Regis Work Your Way.
Hello, my name is Praveen Sandhu. I am an independent arbitrator in Vancouver, Canada, listed with Wassell & Wassell Arbitration Services. The topic I want to discuss today is financing development and resolving disputes that arise in that context. I'll talk about what that might look like here in Vancouver, and then I'll translate the example to what it may look like in an emerging economy. In Vancouver, a developer may be constructing a multi-phase commercial project. The project is local, the funds advanced are tied to lands here, and the parties are familiar with both the financing process and how disputes or roadblocks are resolved. They're reasonably confident in the local processes which are available, which they know and understand. In a developing economy, either a bank or private lender may consider financing a project, say a bridge for example. However, the party providing the financing may have some hesitancy based on the fact that if there is a dispute or roadblock, the project and the funds are in a foreign state. The lender is unfamiliar with the way legal proceedings work in that foreign state, or the lender is familiar and hesitant for that reason. One way to address this is to include a dispute resolution mechanism in the financing arrangement and all contracts related to the development. If the project is being undertaken by a government, then there's the added dimension of public interest. Any roadblocks that could arise out of that also need to be considered and addressed. This doesn't mean you show a potential lender that you're going to rebuild the court system or reform the police. Focus on the project and how it can proceed smoothly. A robust dispute resolution clause in every contract relating to the development demonstrates a commitment to resolving disputes efficiently and moving the project forward to completion on schedule. The host jurisdiction may lack the resources for a protracted dispute as well. The clause demonstrates that interests are aligned. All parties want the project completed efficiently, and that includes the ability to address disputes and remove roadblocks as they arise. A good relationship is not a perfect one in which no disputes arise. It's one in which a dispute is handled and the parties carry on. So, in their contractual arrangements for development projects and in their financing arrangements, developing economies in particular need to include, to the fullest extent possible, dispute avoidance provisions, dispute resolution provisions, early resolution, dispute boards, which include some form of swift enforcement mechanism, and provisions to keep the project moving forward even if there is a dispute. Lastly, they may want to consider some form of mediation, which is a simple and practical way to deal with some issues. In Canada, we say, make yourself feel at home when we want a guest to feel comfortable and secure. A good dispute resolution clause instills the same things: comfort, security, and predictability. Make your lender feel at home.
Awesome words there. So going back to you, Dr. Malcolm, so far we've looked at some of the possible categories of disputes that are common in small economies. So can you give us some examples of the sort of small economy, big problem disputes that arise for businesses?
Every economy, as you know, the small ones, you still have to build roads. You still have to build bridges. A lot of small economies also rely on mining. They rely on tourism, And they rely on a number of things where, interestingly enough, very often, the investment for them comes from external sources in terms of the money, right? So immediately, what are we looking at? Once you're talking about building a road or a bridge, which very often is very heavy in investment in terms of the monies involved, the likelihood is that there's going to be a problem with the contractors, many of whom are foreign contractors, and lenders, most of whom will be foreign lenders, and government or other agencies that are involved in employing them or getting them involved in these projects. So there are a lot of infrastructure-related disputes that will come out of that. Another set of disputes that very often will arise, for example, let's use the tourism sector. In tourism, for example, and again, related again to development and infrastructure, if you're talking about tourism, one of the areas of tourism is the area of cruise shipping. But for there to be a cruise shipping industry, what do you need? You need piers. What are some of the inherent risks related to that? There may be dredging contracts which are not properly carried out. There may be building where the concrete is not properly poured. There may be issues in relation to you ask for a pier to be able to accommodate 3 Oasis class vessels. The contractor delivers something that only has capacity for 2 Oasis class vessels. And these are some of the things that are related there. In the context of small economies, an investment in a pier is very often a huge chunk of the gross domestic product. And it is something which very often you have to think twice about doing, in the understanding that if you do it well and it generates income, the economy as a whole will benefit. The same could happen for your airports and everything else. But what happens there is that because sometimes you're small and you have limited capacity, including negotiating capacity, very often a lot of small and even emerging economies end up in a situation where they do not have the requisite skill sets to properly negotiate their contracts. And one of the areas I find as a dispute management practitioner, which is quite something which I think we need to look at much more closely, is that very often, even where good skill sets go into the negotiating process, typically those skill sets are focused on the commercial arrangements and not necessarily on the dispute management arrangements. But as I often say, however good a commercial arrangement is, if you don't have that arrangement being planned to deal with disputes that are inevitable, and you don't have proper arrangements for how it is that those disputes are going to be resolved, then you could run into a serious problem which ends up undermining what could otherwise have been a good commercial project. We have a situation, for example, again, where because of inadequate skill sets, particularly in the area of dispute resolution, you find oftentimes that even where dispute resolution provisions are included in these contracts that are entered, and there are typically multiplicity of contracts related to single projects, you have that sometimes you overbuild in terms of the dispute resolution clause that you put in, or you sometimes underbuild in terms of the capacity of those clauses. When it gets to the point of dispute resolution, what do you then very often have to end up having to do as small economies? You very often have to then outsource your capacity for getting legal and other representation to deal with the very problems that have been created, which you were hoping would have been able to help you in dealing with your economic growth and development issues by reference to what they would do in terms of being able to help you to generate income. So it's really a cycle, and I think what it means in a very real way is that we have to be a little more thoughtful about what we do. And again, I get back to something I said earlier. We also have to find a way of being able to leverage regions and also to ensure that we have relevant persons always available to us who can be called upon, who have our best interests at heart.
Give us a sense of these consequential disputes that arise at the national level.
One of the things that happens in terms of investment in emerging and developing economies is that most of these economies have signed on to the Washington Convention, which establishes the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, right? And what we then have in these states is that very often in an attempt to attract investment, they enter into bilateral or sometimes multilateral investment treaties. Now, what these treaties typically will provide is for the better of national or equitable treatment to be given to investors coming in. So they are saying as investors, we are prepared to come in and we're prepared to make investment. But when we come in, we need to be treated as in the same way that you would treat any national in your country. Now, in that instance, when they're coming in, they're saying, here are the minimum standards to which we're entitled. Now, if they come in for an investment, and as an investor, they're not properly treated, what do they say? They say this country, the jurisdiction, the state, had held out on the treaty that they were entitled to minimum levels of protection that they have not now received. And in that context, what they sometimes will do, and it happens often enough, is that they will bring what we call an investor-state dispute in the context of ICSID or otherwise sometimes, to be settled. And when they do that, the state, in this case Jamaica or Barbados or whichever other state, would then become a defendant or a respondent in those proceedings. And they would be brought in as respondents because they have not taken adequate steps to ensure that the investor received the level of protection that was promised. In smaller economies, it is rare to find any massive investment in infrastructure development that does not have the state or the country at the core, at the heart of it. So it is unavoidable almost to find major investment in these countries where the state itself, the country itself, will not itself be an appropriate respondent in proceedings where things go bad.
So how do these businesses, or how should these businesses and countries engage large economies and large businesses? And are the fixes to these policy driven, or are there solutions that can be found in dispute management?
Well, it's a combination of two things. In terms of how you engage, your best approach to engagement is being prepared so that when you go to the table, you're able to sit across from the other person to say, I am here to speak to you as an equal in terms of my capacity. Not necessarily an equal in terms of your financial ability, but an equal in terms of how well prepared you are to engage with the relevant issues. So preparation is key. Each project that you're involved in, you must go through a process of analysis which allows you to identify relevant risks, to ensure that you have a proper proposal to be made in terms of how those risks are to be best allocated, and then to have effective mechanisms in place for managing or mitigating those risks. So that is something that you take to the preparation table when you're going there to negotiate. The other thing you need to do when you get to these tables and in these arrangements in terms of ensuring that you're best protected is to ensure that you sign off on nothing without having had proper and relevant advice. Everybody who comes to a negotiating space or a project space comes there. Each person comes with his or her own idea of what they want out of the project. Those ideas are likely, more likely than not, to be in conflict with what the other person wants. Invariably, you end up signing an agreement where you try to balance that. But at the outset, you realize where we started. We started from a point of conflict because we have divergent interests to be served.
Right.
So if you go to that table recognizing that there are divergent interests to be served and conflicts, then at the start of what you're doing, you should start thinking, since I recognize that there are divergent or conflicting issues that give rise to this project in the first place, let us therefore then ensure that whatever we're doing, we're thinking, even though we're not hoping for it, we're thinking of the possibility of a dispute and what we may have to do. So you ensure that built into that relationship, built into the contracts and other arrangements that you enter, are arrangements which allow for dispute avoidance on the one hand, or dispute prevention, same sort of thing, allow for seamless management of conflicts and when they arise, and ultimately for effective resolution in a manner which best suits the project and the parties involved, if that is ultimately where you end up.
Okay, so we're now at the table.
Yes.
So give us an example or two of how an effective disputes management strategy has been or could be useful in a smaller economy business.
Well, let's take mining in Jamaica, bauxite mining in Jamaica. You start from a place where you have, on the one hand, there's a business where their primary objective is profit making. The primary objective of the government is or should be trying to see how they can best protect the interests of their citizens while also allowing for the necessary and required investment to be made that can allow you to get the resources, financial resources, that will allow you to elevate people from positions of poverty to positions of doing well, right? On the other hand, the citizens, their primary objective is, yes, to earn, but to ensure that we live in comfort and we don't have our children having to go to hospital consistently for asthma and other illnesses that may develop as a result of dust nuisance and so on. So there are those conflicting things. So what do you now need to do if you're talking about effective dispute management or conflicts management? The process must start out with effective consultation. With a proper dispute management framework, you say, okay, fine, now that we have identified the possible areas of conflict, now that we have identified as well the real possible interest which is mutual or which is shared by all the parties, how can we now ensure that we have a system of ongoing engagement, which is amicable resolution through consultation, for example? And we're now building out the dispute resolution framework. So we're saying one of the areas that you will want to build in is a process for effective ongoing consultation.
Let's look at another big area that is project financing and management. Can you walk us through the benefits of including an effective disputes management component in a project financing arrangement?
Let's say company A is coming into Jamaica to mine, right? That company may decide to borrow money from Bank X. And the bank may say, we're lending on these conditions. We're expecting to be repaid our interests and principal and penalties and all the other things that may become due over time, right? And we're expecting to be paid in this way. And we're expecting that you're going to be able to generate income from what it is that you're doing to be able to sustain it. And so in that context, you realize that what happens, the project is central to the business of financing. So in the course of project financing, which really is financing specific to a project that is being undertaken, very often infrastructure or other such projects, we call those types of projects, typically we think of them as limited or no recourse financing arrangements. And limited in the sense that from the outset, it is understood that the financing and repayment of it is going to be tied to the project and how well it performs, right? Typically, that's where it is. Now, when you're doing that, there are a number of legal arrangements that you will put in place. You will set up what we call special purpose vehicles or special purpose entities and so on, which are companies which are set up specific to a project. And there are a number of instruments that you could go into, including arrangements that would deal with how you manage tax liabilities, how you manage where you report your profits. There are a number of things that come into play. And all of those are reliant on effective contractual arrangements. Now, what is it that if we go back to contractual arrangements, what is always key in contracts? You have parties. And once you have parties, you have divergent interests. Once you have divergent interests, you have the possibility of conflicts and disputes to be resolved, right? So what you now need to do is to ensure that as you're thinking finance and you're hearing ching ching and you see the money coming through, you're also thinking, what if there's a problem? What do we do? And the what if really is to say, we need to ensure that we have an effective system for managing disputes.
So far, it appears that some of the big ticket topics like climate change and green energy, transportation, transshipment, migration, all of these are connected to money and the ultimate goal of sustainable development. So how can we use these tools of dispute management to deal with the issues so that established goals can be achieved?
Climate change is in the air. So let's stick with that for the minute, right? Now, one of the things that is happening more and more, you have persons and countries more and more interested in clean air and in the sustainability of the planet. Not just the sustainability of businesses anymore, the sustainability of the very planet on which we live. Infrastructure by its very nature is a big carbon producing element of development in any society. So how do you, again, put arrangements in place, and this is where disputes management and contractual arrangements are in place, to ensure that people are limited under the terms of their contract to the extent to which they can be carbon emitting in what they do, and the extent to which they can simply, in which they're required, for example, use renewable resources and so on to the extent possible. Now, what does dispute management do? Dispute management says if you have an obligation to do something and you fail to do it, then the other party should be able to take action against you for your failure and or breach. Mm-hmm. So if it is, for example, you negotiate terms of your contract that says that 30% of the inputs for this project must be made from renewable resources, and you instead do it at 20, then a dispute arises, which has to be managed. So you put effective systems in place, one, to monitor, because a critical element of dispute resolution or dispute management properly done is to ensure for effective monitoring mechanisms, right? So you will have a system where there are persons who are effectively watching to see that you're doing what you have promised to do. And even though that, to somebody looking on, may not be your typical dispute resolution per se activity, it is in the nature of a dispute avoidance mechanism. Because if you say you're to put 30% and you end up putting 20, then a dispute will manifest. If, however, somebody is monitoring to ensure that you put 30 instead of 20, you are now putting in effect a mechanism which avoids you're doing less than what you have promised to do, therefore the dispute is avoided.
Before we go, here are some JAIAC Did You Know facts. Did you know that the JAIAC has entered Memoranda of Understanding and has collaborated with other institutions from across the globe? Did you know as well that Jamaica is a signatory to the 1958 Convention on the Recognition and Enforcement of Foreign Arbitral Awards, New York Convention? In addition, the Jamaican Arbitration Act of 2017 is a pure adoption of the UNCITRAL model law, which is compatible with the New York Convention and supportive of international best practice? Now, that's where we wrap for today, reminding you that we are here at Regis Work Your Way in Jamaica. Please remember to tune in to our bi-weekly Dispute Management in a New World podcast series, available on Buzzsprout, Podbean, Spreaker, the JAIAC's YouTube channel, and wherever else you get your favorite podcast. Until then, I'm your host, Roxene, and on behalf of Dr. Christopher Malcolm and the production team, thank you for joining us. Special thanks to our sponsors, JDIC, Protecting Deposits for You and Me, CIADR, Regis, Work Your Way, iNeutral, Dispute Resolution Made Easy, CP Malcolm, Dispute Management Practitioner, ADEB Consultants, Consulting Engineers for almost 60 years, Impact Justice, Improved Access to Justice in the Caribbean, and Wassel & Wassel Arbitrators Services Incorporated.
I save because one day my little business is going to be a big deal.
Yeah, and I make sure to put away a little something for him.
And thanks to JDIC, deposit insurance protection on my savings gone up.
You've been upgraded. Deposits held in commercial banks, building societies, and merchant banks are covered under the JDIC deposit insurance scheme up to $1.2 million per depositor per institution. JDIC.
Protecting deposits for you and me.
Book rooms by the hour or as long as you need. Regis meeting rooms are the perfect setting for your next pitch, interview, board meeting, or workshop. They're equipped with the latest technology, a friendly support team, and catering on request to ensure everything runs smoothly. Experience our meeting room solutions. Book your tour today by calling 876-618-8800 or visit regus.com.jm. That's regus.com.jm.
All our episodes are also distributed on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Deezer, Stitcher, Podcast Index, Pandora, TuneIn plus Alexa, Podchaser, Podcast Addict, and wherever else you get your favorite podcasts.